Good morning. It's good to see everyone here today. It's certainly good that we can gather together to worship our God. It's been an encouraging and beneficial morning so far. I hope that continues as we open up His Word and study from it. We have many visitors that are here, and we're so glad that you're here. Our goal at Broadmoor is to give God glory and honor and praise in all that we do, both inside this building as we come together, but also as we leave here. So we're thankful for your presence here and invite you back anytime that you have an opportunity. Appreciate Mark reading Psalm 146 for us. If you look at that psalm, you see a chaotic world. There is trouble. Mountains are shaking. The waters are roaring. Nations are raging. And the kingdoms, it says, they totter. There is a great deal of instability. The earth, it says, is melting away. And it's melting away in chaos. And when we see that kind of world, that is the kind of world that produces in us oftentimes a fearful heart. It's not comfortable to live in a chaotic world. We seek stability. We seek comfort. And so when we live in a world of chaos, often our heart follows the circumstances. But notice that the psalmist presents a contrast with this chaotic world, and that is a stable God. God is a refuge and strength in trouble, it says in verse 1. He provides security in the unknown. He is an ever-present stability in times of change. And the contrast is striking. Everything in the world seems to be unstable in Psalm 46, but God is exactly the opposite. He is stable and firm. Everything in the world is unstable, but God is not. And so instead of a fearful heart, the psalmist calls us to have a still mind. Our response to the troubles of life often depends on our understanding of exactly who God is. In verses 8 and 9, it says, "Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth." We see that we can develop this still mind when we know who God is. It is God that takes that chaos of the world and he brings desolation, not so much to the world itself, but to the chaos of the world. And he makes wars and frictions to cease and to stop. And so the psalmist concludes in verse 10 with a call that we've been focusing on this year. Be still and know that I am God. And that's our goal this year and really as Christians, to develop a still heart and mind. Being still is more than just taking time out from the day. In fact, it's not that in isolation. Being still is more than a 15-minute refresher, a short nap, or even a weekend getaway from the hustle and bustle of life. We often associate stillness with trying to be still for a moment. But biblical stillness is more than getting away from the noise. It is a disposition of the heart. It is more than a moment. It is a mindset. Stillness is not the absence of activity. It is the absence of anxious striving. It is not a break from life, but rather it is a way of life. And true stillness means knowing God. More than anyone else, I think we see the perfect example of stillness in Jesus Christ. In fact, this is going to be a little bit of a shotgun approach. We're going to look at many different episodes in the life of Jesus. We're not going to be able to look at any one of these in depth. So if you want more sermon material, I haven't taken all the life of Jesus. If you want to look at the theme this year, a lot of these deserve a deeper dive. more than anyone else, Jesus lived out Psalm 46. He was still and knew his God. Now, he wasn't always physically still, was he? He was extremely busy preaching and proclaiming the kingdom of God. He had compassion and he healed those in need. He confronted and he served. But his soul was fully settled in God. So I'd like to look at a series of episodes in Jesus' life when Jesus was still. And I think we can learn a lot from his life. Jesus could be still because he knew God. Stillness begins with knowing God. We see that in several different episodes in Jesus' life. The first one that I think about is the fact that he withdrew to pray. Jesus was busy announcing the kingdom, as I mentioned, proclaiming the gospel. His work was extremely important. And as you can imagine, he was bombarded with the needs of the world. But even so, Mark 1 and verse 35 tells us that he rose early in the morning to find a desolate place, a place by himself with God, so that he could pray and commune with the Father. In Luke 5, we see that the crowds are pressing around. News of his healings had spread, and even more crowds had come to him. Yet he would still withdraw, even in the midst of the busyness, to a desolate place and pray. You know, I think about him in my own life. Often when I'm busiest, that's sometimes when I push prayer to the side. We might reason that we have too much work to do and there's too little time. We don't have time to pray. But notice what Jesus did. Jesus knew that his work was important as well. In fact, he realized that his work was too important not to pray. Prayer was not an afterthought, something that if he had enough time, then he set some time aside for that. But rather, prayer was the foundation of his ministry. And I think we see in this his character, and it was one of dependence upon the Father. His work was not built on self-sufficiency, but rather dependence on God. We also see Jesus sleeping in the storm. More than any other episode, this episode reminds me of Psalm 46. It's a chaotic world. The disciples and Jesus are in a boat and they're in the midst of the storm. They're not in a house, a secure structure in the midst of the storm. You know, that can make that a lot easier, but they're in the middle of the Sea of Galilee when this storm approaches. The storm is raging and the disciples find themselves in the middle of it and they are frightened. Mark 4 and verse 37 says, "And a great windstorm arose and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. But Jesus, he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion." The disciples are consumed with what the storm is doing. And they want to know if Jesus even cares if they're perishing. But Jesus could rest in the midst of the storm because he knew who was in control. Jesus was still, and he displays his trust here in God. Jesus could be still because he knew God was his source and his strength. And so these are a couple episodes when we see Jesus was still and he takes time to be with God and trust God. When we know God, it also changes the way that we respond to others, and we see this in the life of Jesus. In John chapter 8, the scribes and the Pharisees bring a woman caught in adultery to Jesus. They invoke the law and demand a judgment. But John tells us that they were testing Jesus, looking for something that they could use against him. If you can put yourself in that scene, everyone here is wanting an immediate answer. Everyone here is wanting a verdict. And if you were in that position, it would have been very easy to follow the crowd or what the expectations of the crowd were, to simply meet what they wanted you to do. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus is still. He doesn't rush to judgment. He knows something about God that the accusers have forgotten, and that is that God is merciful. Now, in this episode, Jesus doesn't condone sin. In fact, he tells the woman to go and sin no more, but he recalls the very mercy of God. And he takes time in stillness to reflect upon that. We also see that Jesus takes time to wash feet. As the disciples jockeyed for position in the kingdom, often arguing about who was the greatest, Jesus demonstrates something completely different. Instead of clawing for the top, he left an example as their master and teacher of what it means to be a servant. They were the students, yet Jesus took the lower position. In John 13 and verse 3, it states something interesting. It says that Jesus, knowing the Father had given all things into his hand. You see, Jesus didn't have to prove his greatness or demand others' recognition to know who he was. Jesus knew who he was. He knew where he came from and where he was going. He knew the Father. And because of that, he was able to serve the disciples. Knowing God leads to humility and service. In another episode of Jesus' life, we see silence, and this one is startling because it's so different from how most people respond. When Jesus was arrested, he was tried by both the religious leaders and also the civil leaders, Pilate, the governor. Matthew 26 and verse 59, it tells us that they were even given false testimony against him. I don't know about you, but if someone brings an accusation against me, my tendency is one of anxious activity. I'm doing everything possible to refute the claim, to declare my innocence, especially if we know the accusations are false. And what's funny is, even if we're guilty, we often declare our innocence. We don't want that hanging over our head. And yet Jesus does something completely different. He didn't defend himself against every accusation. He was silent. He was still. And how could he do that? I think he was still because he knew it was God that is the righteous judge. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 23 spells this out. It says, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. In the toughest of circumstances, Jesus was still demonstrating his meekness. Jesus was still because he knew God, and that knowledge shaped how he treated others and acted before them. We also see that stillness trusts God with the outcome. One of the hardest things about a chaotic world is it's hard to see where that leads. Or we may feel like it's only going to lead to danger or trouble or harm to ourselves. And that uncertainty creates anxiety in our hearts. We don't like living in that kind of chaotic world. But Jesus trusted God even when he didn't know exactly how things would turn out. In the Garden of Gethsemane, death was looming for Jesus as he prayed to the Father. And Jesus is still in this moment. And I don't think it's that he is still because he doesn't know what's going to happen. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. He knows that death is looming. But look at his prayer. He says, let this cup pass from me. But not as I will. It's not about what I want, but it is as you will. Stillness is not the absence of anguish, but rather it means trusting God in the midst of anguish. And that's what we see in Jesus. Jesus surrenders his will to the Father, and he finds stillness and peace in that surrender. When the mobs approach to arrest Jesus, he doesn't run and flee. He doesn't resist. He steps forward and willingly gives himself into their hands. Jesus is still, even when facing death. We see that further as he endures the cross. Jesus didn't want to suffer on the cross. We just looked at his prayer in Gethsemane. He prayed that the cup of suffering might pass from him. When he was on the cross, people passed by and insulted him and mocked him. They mistakenly stated, he saved others, he cannot save himself. Despite the fact that there was a Roman guard and he was nailed to the cross, Jesus had every ability to come down from the cross. He had the ability to call a legion of angels that would make things right, that would be able to protect him and rescue him. But Jesus is not moved on the cross by selfish interests. He submits to the Father's will because he knows that the Father's purpose is the redemption of all people. Jesus was not selfish in this moment, but he demonstrates perfect love. It was love that kept him on the cross. And he was still, not because the circumstances were beyond his control, but because he trusted the Father and he loved us enough to remain. One other example of stillness, trusting God with the outcome. Jesus was still in the tomb. We see that Jesus was executed on the cross, and after that happens, Joseph takes the body. It says that he wraps the body in a linen cloth, and he lays the body in a new tomb cut from the rock. In some ways, this is the ultimate picture of stillness, if you think about it. Jesus is dead. The tomb is sealed. The disciples have scattered and they're disappointed at what they think is the outcome of defeat. The authorities think that they have solved this problem. The issue appears to be in the past. Nothing seems to be happening. And Jesus is still for a period, but he has not been destroyed. Death does not have the final word. He will live again. I think this picture of Jesus and his stillness here reveals his hope. And it's a lesson for us as well. Even when there is no visible evidence that anything is happening, God's promise remains true. God doesn't always, or I would say God rarely acts in our timing, but he acts in his. Sometimes stillness means waiting while God does what we cannot yet see. And that's the beautiful thing about Sunday. When Sunday came and Jesus had been raised, we see that Sunday proves that God's silence was not God's absence. God is active and living. Jesus was still because he knew God could be trusted with the outcome. We've looked at several episodes in the life of Jesus, and we've seen several moments when he was still, and there's many more that we could probably come up with. He was still when he separated himself from the crowds in order to pray. He was still in the storm. He was still when the mobs gathered around and wanted justice or judgment. He was still when he served his disciples, even though they were clamoring for greatness. He was still when he stood before his accusers and when he faced death. He prayed in the garden that the cup might pass from him. He was still on the cross, and he was still in the tomb. And in every one of these episodes, I think we see that Jesus' stillness was connected to what he knew about the Father. Here's a chart we might look at. When Jesus was still, we looked at all these episodes. What did he know? When Jesus was still in prayer, he knew God's presence, and that allowed him to be dependent and recognize his dependence. When Jesus was still in the storm, he understood and knew God's power, and he can trust in God as the truly powerful one. When Jesus was still, right before he wrote in the dust, he recognized God's mercy, and he could extend mercy because of that. When Jesus was still in service, it says he knew what God had purposed for him, and he could act with humility and service, leaving an example to the disciples. When Jesus was still before his accusers, he understood God's justice and that God would make all things right, and he could respond with meekness. When Jesus faced death in the garden and on the cross, he understood God's will and God's love, and he could surrender that and express love himself. And Jesus was still in the tomb, knowing God's promise, yet he lives and displayed his hope. That common thread, I think, points to really the point I want to make in this lesson. If we go back to Psalm 46 and verse 10, be still and know that I am God. Those things are connected. If we would know God more, I think that would transform our lives. Stillness is not just taking 15 minutes to the side. It's not just taking a break. It's not just a moment. Stillness is a mindset. It is a way of living. So the question for you is, what would change in your life if you really knew God? How would your life look differently? We don't live in a still world, do we? We live in a world like Psalm 46 that's described as busy, noisy, uncertain, and chaotic, sometimes frightening and violent. The mountains shake, the waters roar, and nations rage. Yet the message is straightforward. In the midst of that chaotic world, be still and know God. The circumstances don't have to become still before our hearts can become still. And that's what we see in Jesus. Jesus didn't live a quiet, easy life, but his heart remained steadfast and secure because he knew God. And so that raises the question for us, what would change in my life? What would change in your life if we truly knew God? If you knew that God was present, I think you could depend on him more, couldn't you? If you knew God was powerful, you could place your trust in him. If you knew of God's mercy and his justice and his love, we can demonstrate those things and trust God with the outcome. If we knew that God's will was and is good, we could surrender our will to his. If we know God's promises are true, we can hope while we wait. I think that's biblical stillness. It's not escaping the chaos of life. It is learning to live with a heart settled in God. Jesus was still, not because his life was still, but because he knew God. And we can too. If your heart is unsettled today, come to God. Be still and know that he is God and trust your life to him. It may be that you would like to make changes in your life. God calls you to be his child. He wants you to be his child. Not only to become his child, but to remain in steadfast trust with him. So if you need to become a Christian, the invitation is extended here this very day. God wants you to be his child. If you are a Christian and not living as you should, the invitation is extended today. God wants you to come back and closer to him. If there's any way that we can help you this morning, please come as we stand and sing it.